This video is part of a new series focusing on criminal law. We'll be starting with the fundamentals of criminal offences, that is, the elements of a crime. This video is going to be an overview to get a clear picture of what the elements of a crime includes. So make note of the important parts, principles and cases so you can research them later on to fill in the details. The reason I'm taking this macro approach is so that you can see the links and relationships between the elements and what both elements can consist of. So let's first look at the actus reus. This is the physical element of the crime, an act the defendant does. The defendant needs to satisfy the actus reus of the crime to be guilty, and the actus reus is different for each and every crime. The actus reus is generally defined by Parliament in a statute, or it's developed over time in common law. There are a couple of key features to know about the actus reus. It must be a voluntary act, so the defendant must be in full control. However, there are state of affair cases where the defendant is convicted even though he doesn't want the act to happen. The actions were committed against their will. So that's another key feature. The next is that the defendant satisfies the actus reus when they fail to act. This is known as an omission. They can only satisfy an actus reus via omission only if they have a duty to act. So if there's no duty, then there is no actus reus, there's no omission. And a duty to act arises in a select few scenarios. And each of these scenarios you need to know, and each of them come with a case that you also need to memorize. You also have to prove causation for some crimes. This is where the defendant's act caused the consequence. So you have two crimes that you need to know: conduct crimes and consequence crimes. Conduct crimes are crimes that only require the act, not consequence of the act. And then consequence crime require an act as well as the consequence of the act, so the accident. So like having excess alcohol in your bloodstream, that's a conduct crime because you don't need to have an accident. Just having the excess alcohol in your bloodstream is a conduct crime. So for consequence crimes, you need to prove causation. You need to prove that the act caused the consequence. And there are two types of causation that the prosecution needs to prove. The first is factual causation, which is the but-for test, explained in the case White. It states, but for the defendant's act, the victim wouldn't have been killed, robbed, or whatever the crime was. And then once factual causation is proven, the prosecution must prove legal causation, which is explained in the case Paget. It states that the defendant's act doesn't need to be the sole cause, it just needs to be a significant cause. It also must be proved that there wasn't an act which broke the chain of causation. The chain of causation can be thought of as the cause and effect link between the defendant's act and the victim's injury. So if there was an intervening act which broke this link, this chain, then the defendant wouldn't satisfy the actus reus. The intervening act can be one of three. It can be an act committed by a third person, an act committed by the victim themselves, or an act of God, or some may know it as a natural and unpredictable event. There are also cases for these three which you need to note and memorize. So after the actus reus is satisfied, the prosecution must prove that the defendant had the necessary mens rea, which is the mental element of the offence. Mens rea tends to have a subjective and objective element. Mens rea of a crime can take several different forms, each of which you ought to know. The first two, the most important two, are intention and recklessness. Intention is given its normal meaning and is left for the jury to decide. So the jury decides whether the defendant had the necessary mens rea, had the necessary state of mind. And there are two types of intention, both of which are subjective. That's direct and oblique intent. Direct is a specific intention and is defined using the case Mohan. Oblique intent is where the outcome of the behaviour was indirectly intended. So the outcome of their actions were indirectly intended. The result might have not been their main goal, but the defendant could foresee that the consequence was virtually certain. And then you have another form of mens rea, and this is the principle of transferred malice, and it's used to establish mens rea. So transferred malice is where the mens rea is transferred from an intended victim to an unintended victim. So for example, if I intended to shoot one person but I missed and shot someone else, the mens rea will be transferred from the intended victim to the one that got shot, the unintended victim. This allows for the mens rea to align with the actus reus. And finally, there is the contemporaneity rule, coincidence of the actus reus and mens rea, meaning that the mens rea must be present at the same time when the actus reus is carried out. The actus reus and mens rea must coincide. The case Tarbell-Melli introduces the transaction theory, and it states that the actus reus is part of a larger sequence of events and the mens rea is formed at some point during that sequence. And the more commonly used theory is the continuing act theory, which was introduced in the case Church. It states that the actus reus is part of one continuing act, and the mens rea happened at some point during the act. The rule was expanded on in the case Fagan, where an act, followed by an omission, is also counted as a continuing act. So make notes of the cases Church, Fagan, and Tarbell-Melli. So that brings that to an end. Hopefully you have a better understanding of the elements of a crime, and you have taken notes of the important cases that you need to research and memorize. I'll see you in the next part.